Stoneville, North Carolina is a southern town of less than 10,000 people, nearly 40 miles north of Winston-Salem.
Stoneville is such a great little town. So small that if you blink your eyes, you're going to miss it too. It's a great neighborhood, good people, very safe place to live.
It's here that 36-year-old Julie Curry Boyd has recently moved with her 3 boys and husband Kenneth.
Hey, did you get the mower working?
Spaghetti again?
Kenneth was a truck driver, so she didn't have to deal with it much but on weekends. I think they were miserable, and it didn't matter what it was, they were gonna argue.
Have you had enough?
Knock, knock.
Oh, hey, Craig.
Luckily, Julie now has family living nearby, including her brother, Craig.
What's cooking, neighbors? Smells good in here.
Craig and I lived next door. It was 3 houses. Her dad and her mom lived in the middle house. I lived on the right side, and Julie lived on the left side. Living close beside each other when, if I had a problem or something, need extra help, maybe with the kids or anything, she was there willing to help. It was very nice.
Doing some yard work?
Greg?
Okay.
Hey, Ken, can you put... I don't even know why I try. Kenneth was strange. He wasn't home a lot. When he was home, he was more self-centered. He cared more about himself than anything else.
Months into living near Julie's family, things aren't any better between Julie and Kenneth. In fact, they've only gotten worse.
What are you doing here? Am I supposed to be at work?
No. Lost it.
Lost what?
Job. Just wasn't working out.
What? You just got that job. I mean, we haven't even lived here that long yet. I unpacked the last box yesterday. What are we gonna do? We need that money. Kenneth had a lot of trouble holding down jobs. I think Kenneth's drinking problem affected his jobs. Julie was fed up with his behavior. You promised to cut back on the booze. What is that, your 3rd drink since dinner? Not to mention, God knows how many you've been sneaking out there in that shed of yours.
You don't know anything.
Well, we'll just see about that.
Where do you think you're going?
Let go of me, jerk.
You won't repeat that? Yeah, I didn't think so.
Finally, Julie decides she's had enough.
They're separated several times. She would always go back to him because she was afraid. I said, Julie, he is not going to hurt you. He loves himself too much to jeopardize his own life. He ain't gonna hurt you. I tried to encourage her not to go back to him.
On her own for the first time in 13 years, Julie does her best to embrace life as a single mom.
Julie loved being a mom. Them kids loved her. They were always clinging to her. That's the only, I think, joy she ever had, having her kids.
Hey.
Hey.
What'll it be today?
Oh, I'll have vanilla in a cup, please.
Okay.
Can I get cookies and cream in a cup, please?
How daring.
What do you have on your shirt? Okay.
So, boys just moved into that blue house down the street, right?
Yes, sir.
Is that your dad I saw moving out the other day?
Boys, I'll meet you at the car.
No. If you ever need anything, anything at all, just let me know, okay? I've got a soft spot for single mothers.
You keep the change.
Julie was on edge a lot. The least little thing would set her off. Those kids were her life. I don't know what she'd have done without them.
Weeks go by and Julie starts to settle into her new normal.
Living close beside each other, we helped each other out. We became close. It was nice.
Yeah, there's 52 of them there. Everybody in? Okay. Mom, you need some money too. Okay.
Yeah, and that I can tell is magic.
Oh, Dad. You have a terrible poker face.
That's no way to talk to your dad.
Hold that thought. Oh, one.
Okay, here's one.
Thank you.
And
Hello?
Julie, it's me. Don't hang up.
Kenneth, I can't talk right now.
So just take a second.
No, I'm not ready. I need more time.
We belong together, Julie.
No,
You know it's true.
listen.
Let me make it up to you. I'll be different, I swear.
I think Kenneth felt like she was his property. And it was not a partnership, it was an ownership. That's the only way I can figure that he would kept coming up harassing her like it.
Just let me come home.
No, you're
Sorry.
not listening. Stop.
I won't stop. Till you give me a chance.
what was all that?
Just ignore it. Come on, we got a game to play. Yeah. So where were we?
She wouldn't listen to you when you tried to give her advice. You know, sometimes when you're giving people advice, you know when to shut up. What do you do?
But soon, even Julie must admit that there's cause for concern. From her husband of 13 years, Julie Curry Boyd is awoken by a loud pounding in the middle of the night.
Kenneth? What are you doing here? It's the middle of the night. You scared me half to death.
You know what I'm doing here? I'm a wreck without you. Can't you see that?
Once Kenneth moved out, he still came and harassed Julie, make noises and stuff to scare her. When she was staying by herself with the kids,
I can't live like this. It's not right. I should be here. With you. This is my home!
Kenneth, please. The kids are in bed. You just gotta keep it down, okay?
Let them here! Let them out here! I don't care! All right, Kenneth. It's time to go. No, I ain't going. Not till she gives me a chance. I said leave. Now. Come on. Before I call the police.
Craig would have protected Julie. He would have done anything to have kept Julie safe.
Fine. I'll go. For now. But I'll be back. This ain't over, Julie.
It was scaring him at night. But I don't know that she called the police or not, because I don't think it was anything they would have done unless he'd done something first.
Still, Julie's family does convince her to take some action.
Thanks, Dad. I'm still not sure all this is necessary. Don't you think we may be overreacting just a bit?
Maybe, honey, but better safe than sorry. Hardware. Please.
She changed the locks on the house. Even though he was out of the house, all the other family members, they were there to protect Julie from him.
Julie resolves to never go back to Kenneth again. She's come too far.
All right. Give me all you got.
All right.
Oh. What the hell is this?
It's not mine. You think I could drink that stuff? That stuff's gross.
Let's go inside and grab some sweet tea or something. Come on.
Everyone was hoping that Kenneth would go away after the separation, that somebody would hide out behind her home. There were times when you just say, that's not right, you shouldn't have to go through this.
It's not long before it begins feeling like nowhere is safe.
Get a grip, Julie.
Okay. Everybody have their PJs, toothbrush?
All that stuff's at Dad's house.
Okay, just checking.
Though Julie wants to stay far away from Kenneth, she's not ready to make the same rule for her kids.
I don't think she cared for him getting the kids, but she didn't feel right keeping them away from their daddy.
Hey, have a good time. See you later tonight. Love you. Thanks so much for doing this, Dad. You know, I just can't stomach facing him myself these days. The boys will be okay?
They're gonna be fine. Just try and relax. Do something for yourself.
Yeah.
They'll be back before you know it.
You're right.
Julie's biggest pain was probably giving up her boys for any length of time to spend with Kenneth. She would stay busy, and I think it's because she was so worried about the kids.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah, it's good to see you again. You guys must not be eating much ice cream these days, huh? Either that or you're avoiding me.
Oh, yeah, you know how it is. Just been busy.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks again.
As hard as it is on Julie when the boys are away, they are never gone for long.
Hi, Mom, we're home.
In here! Hey, did you have a good time?
Yeah,
Yeah?
yeah, it's fine. Dad said to give you this.
What's that?
Don't know. Just said you should open it right away.
Well, I'm gonna need a minute. Can you stick it over there on the pile of meal for me, sweetie? Thanks. You hungry?
No, we just ate.
Well, did you at least save room for a little dessert?
Yes.
Okay, good. Go get Christopher. I got the cake ready.
The man that gives a child a bullet is nothing but pure evil.
Julie Curry Boyd has just received a terrifying gift from her estranged husband.
Kenneth sent the middle child, Jamie, home with a bullet and told him to give this to your mama and tell her this one is for her.
My thoughts about any man who would give a child a bullet to give to their mother is not a man. He is not a man at all.
Fearing for her life and the lives of her children, Julie decides she can't stay in this house a second longer.
I know that she was on edge. She moved in with Mom and Dad to get away from that.
Now, I don't want you to worry. Okay? Everything's fine. You just need to give Daddy a few weeks. We'll stay here for a little while and go back home when things settle down. Okay?
Okay, Mom.
All right, sweet dreams, my angels.
Sweet dreams, Mom.
She kept everything to herself a lot, but I think she was totally horrified.
While Julie may feel safer inside her parents' home, the reality is that Kenneth's reign of terror only grows.
I'll get it. Yeah, hello. Oh, Kenneth.
Come on out here.
Whoa. Calm down, Kenneth. I can't understand a word you're saying.
When Julie had moved back in with Mom and Dad, Kenneth called my father and threatened him.
That's about enough, Kenneth. What? We've got nothing to do with this. This is between you and Julie. I'm gonna hang up now. Goodbye.
I'm so sorry.
Kenneth turned against the rest of the family because he felt like they stood between him and Julie. He felt like he should come and go there as he pleased, that the kids was his, and she was his property.
Over the next few days, the threats continue, until one day when Kenneth just can't stay away any longer.
What's up, Dad?
Hey, kiddos. Oh, sure have missed you. Hey, we said we'd go for a drive. Maybe get some pizza?
Yeah.
That'd be fun? All right, jump in. Let's do it.
What are you doing here?
I want to see my kids. They're mine too, you know. Can't just keep them from me.
Kenneth would take the kids away from Julie. He'd use those kids to hurt her so much. It was unreal.
Come on, Mom. He's taking us out to pizza. We'll be right back, please.
Yeah, okay. You can go. Lunch. And then right back here. Agreed?
Julie was very worried about her kids because her kids was her life. That was her joy, was her kids. And I'm sure until he brought them back home, she was very worried about them.
What's all this?
Boys are with Kenneth. I can't stop worrying, so I'm keeping busy.
Well, at least I get a clean house out of it. Hey, give me the broom. I'll keep you company.
I think she felt safer with her father being in the house. He was a good man.
Thanks, Fluffy.
Don't let him beat us, come on!
Hey,
You made him whoop you!
I had it!
You didn't have nothing. Oh, me. I can't take y'all anywhere.
Thanks for the pizza, Dad.
You kids always eat that much food? I thought I had 3 boys, not 3 horses.
Mom calls us vacuum cleaners. You think she misses us? Maybe I'll give her the rest of my pizza. I bet she'd like that.
Kenneth, he was strange. I have no idea what made him snap that day.
You okay, Dad? What's that for, Dad?
Never you mind.
Come on, Dad, let's put their nose right.
I said, never mind.
Where are we going, Dad?
Let's just say that everybody who lives in that house is about to get what's coming to them.
A family outing has just taken an unexpected turn for Kenneth Boyd and his 3 children.
I'm sure the boys was terrified in that car and probably not wanting to believe that their daddy was even thinking this.
You sure Mom allowed you to use her stove?
I don't care what your mom says. I do not burn hot water. More than once a week. There you go. Watch it. It's hot.
So Kenneth brought the kids home. The kids got out of the car begging him to stop doing what he was going to do.
Hello?
Mom!
Christopher?
Mom!
Christopher?
Mom! Dad!
What's wrong?
Dad! He's got a gun. He says he's going to kill everybody.
Kenneth had just decided that today was the day that she was going to die.
I'll handle this. I'll call 911. Whoa, Kenneth. Put down the gun. Let's just talk.
No!
He pulled out a gun and shot Dillard Curry and killed him instantly.
Dad wasn't able to defend himself. He had just got out of the hospital with a heart attack. After Kenneth killed my daddy, he went in the house.
We have to hide.
And Julie couldn't get out the front door.
Your brothers. Where are your brothers?
The other two boys came to my house, and Craig went upstairs to get his gun.
It's okay. It's okay. You're safe now.
No, you don't understand. He's got a gun. He's going to kill everyone.
We are not going to let anything happen to you, okay?
We've got to get out of here.
I don't think I really had time to get scared. My thoughts was getting the kids and getting them out of there.
But Julie and Christopher are still inside the house with no way out and limited places they can hide.
Kenneth, stop!
She was afraid for her life. Kenneth did not want her, and he didn't want anybody else to have her.
No! No.
Goodbye, Julie.
No!
When this was all happening, Kenneth was shooting Julie. Julie fell on top of Chris. He wanted to protect his mother.
Dad? No? Please.
Chris loved his mom and would have done anything. He tried everything he could to get Kenneth to stop.
He shot Julie, and then he went out the door. And he reloaded when he got back outside.
But before he can go back inside, something steals Kenneth's attention.
Where do you think you're going?
He hollered back at Craig and said, "Come on up here, big boy. I got one for you too."
Run, now!
Craig told us to get out of the house and go to the woods and hide. And that's what we did.
Don't make me shoot you, Kenneth. No!
When something like that happens, you don't think. His gun was on safety. He didn't think to take it off.
Get back here! I got a bullet for you, big boy!
Craig would have done anything to protect Julie. That's why Kenneth wanted to kill him. Kenneth had every intention of killing anybody that got in his way of getting to Julie.
Meanwhile, Christopher does all he can to keep his mother out of harm's way.
Please state your emergency.
I just shot my wife and my father-in-law. You better come get me.
He gave us the location, stated that he would give up once we arrived and come and get him. As a 911 operator, that would be an odd call to get.
Okay, Julie, where were we? Julie, where are you? Just come on out. You can't hide forever.
Julie Curry Boyd and her son Christopher are being hunted by her estranged husband, Kenneth.
Kenneth Boyd had shot Julie's father and then entered through the living room. Christopher was trying to help his mother and retreat to the bedroom.
Are you okay?
Julie, where are you? Just come on out. You can't hide forever. There you are.
It's not too late. You can still look away.
Julie! Mom! Run! To the woods now!
I had two of Julie and Kenneth's boys. Me and all them went to the woods and lay down in the ditch. Once I got to the woods, the gunshot stopped, but I did not know where Kenneth was. And I just told the kids, whatever happens, y'all stay right here and lay down. Just be quiet. I was hearing some noise in the woods, sound like somebody walking, sound like footsteps.
It's then that Betty Curry sees a welcome sight.
I saw the blue lights of the police cars pulling in my driveway.
But Betty and the kids aren't out of danger yet.
When we arrived, our information being given to us by dispatch was that we still had an active shooter. At that point, he ran out in front of us.
Freeze! Rockingham County Police! Drop your weapon! Don't shoot! Here I am. I shot him. Shot my wife and father-in-law.
He had his hands above his head, telling us that he was the one that had done it. He was not going to give us any trouble.
They're in the woods, all of them, a few yards that away.
Cuff, go see who he's talking about. I'm going inside.
You never know what you'll find in this situation. Our initial entry, we wanted to see if either victim was still alive, and we also wanted to check the remainder of the house to make sure that there was no one else inside of the house. We see Mr. Curry. There was a pool of blood coming out from under his chest, and he was obviously deceased.
Hello?
There were shell casings littered throughout the residence.
Rockingham County Police. Anybody down there?
Our next thought is to locate Julie as well as any other victims that may be in the house.
Come on out, it's the police.
Julie Boyd was found shot multiple times and deceased.
It's okay. Come on out. It's the police. We'll get you some help.
I just can't imagine what the son went through seeing his father shoot his grandfather first and then shooting his mother multiple times. Julie's mother also lived in the home, and she worked a second shift job, and she was at work the night that this incident occurred. And I fully believe if she had been home, that this would have been a triple homicide and not a double homicide.
Kenneth Boyd is immediately taken into police custody, where he makes a full confession.
I don't know why I did it. Just like Vietnam all over again.
Kenneth, put down the gun. Let's just talk.
I just saw my targets and I had to shoot.
It's not too late. Get to talk, okay?
Kenneth was in the military, but from my understanding, he never saw no shooting. He drove a bulldozer. He really believed that he was going to get by with it. By just saying that he had a flashback and all he saw was silhouettes. He did not have no flashback. When you get on the phone and say, I just killed my wife and my father-in-law, you didn't have no flashback. You didn't see silhouettes. You knew what you was doing. Kenneth was just pure evil.
On July 14th, 1994, Kenneth Boyd is convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. 11 years later, he becomes the 1,000th prisoner to be executed in the United States since the capital punishment ban was lifted in 1976.
When Kenneth was executed, no, I did not want to see that. Just knowing that he was enough.
It's been 30 years since Kenneth killed my daddy and my sister. I blame God. I blamed myself because I didn't see it coming. It is one of the hardest things in the world anybody can go through. And no one understands it. No one, you can say, I'm so sorry, I understand. No, you don't. You just don't. My mom took the children in. Mama did not want to separate the children. And that was a big deal for her. So she kept them.
My heart goes out to those 3 boys. They lost a mother and father that day. The boys did not want to talk about anything that had happened. And as far as I know, one of the boys has said that he cannot remember anything of his childhood. He cannot remember his childhood at all. I don't think you can recover from something like that.
For 61 years, one name remained buried inside an old Albany murder file.
Catharine Blackburn.
50 years old. A supervisor at the Mohawk Brush Company. A woman known to family and co-workers as private, dependable, and deeply devoted to the people around her. Then, on September 13, 1964, something entered her home on Colony Street that would change an entire family forever. By the following day, Catherine was dead. Her killer was gone. And the evidence that could eventually expose him would remain silent for more than 6 decades. Albany, New York, was not prepared for what investigators found inside the house at 117 Colony Street. Catherine had been brutally attacked. She had suffered a devastating blow to the head. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been cut and stabbed. The violence continued after she was already unconscious. Investigators determined that heated knives had been used to burn her body. It was a crime so disturbing that authorities struggled to explain it. The killer had not simply entered a house looking for valuables. Nothing about the scene suggested an ordinary burglary. The apartment had not been ransacked. There was no obvious theft. Instead, investigators were looking at something far more frightening. A woman had apparently allowed a stranger into her home. And that stranger had turned against her. The first crucial detail was connected to Catherine's decision to rent out part of her house. She had placed advertisements seeking a tenant for an upstairs apartment. She had recently shown the space to a prospective renter. One name appeared on a receipt: Robert Broadhead. For investigators in 1964, that name seemed like the doorway into the mystery. But the doorway led nowhere. There was no confirmed Robert Broadhead who could be established as the man responsible. The name may have been false. The receipt itself disappeared. Yet the impression of the writing remained. Investigators would later use the pressure marks left on another sheet of paper to reconstruct what had been written. A name. A possible identity. A possible lie. The crime scene yielded other fragments. A footprint.
Blood.
Paper. Physical evidence preserved by investigators who could not possibly have known that a future generation would possess technology capable of reading information hidden inside those objects. But in 1964, DNA profiling did not exist. The word genetic genealogy meant nothing. There was no modern database capable of connecting biological material to distant relatives. Investigators had fingerprints, witness descriptions, handwriting, footprints, interviews, and instinct. They had to build a case the old-fashioned way. And the killer knew it. Outside Catherine's home, Albany detectives worked through the neighborhood. They asked questions. Who had seen Catherine? Who had visited? Who knew she was renting the apartment? Who had been near Colony Street? Who had disappeared after the murder? Witnesses provided fragments of information. A stranger. A potential tenant. A man whose identity could not be verified. The investigation widened. Names were examined. Suspects were considered. Even notorious figures associated with violent crimes elsewhere were reportedly examined in connection with the case. But nothing produced the answer. The investigation eventually slowed. Then it stopped. The newspapers moved on. The city moved on. But Catherine's family could not. her niece, Sandy Carmichael, was among those whose lives were permanently marked by what happened. Years became decades. The 1960s became the 1970s. The 1970s became the 1980s. The world changed around the case. Computers appeared. Forensic science advanced. DNA entered criminal investigations. Old murder cases began to reopen. But Catherine Blackburn's killer remained unidentified. Then came a discovery that changed the direction of the case. Inside the evidence preserved from 1964 was biological material. It had survived. For decades, the evidence had waited in silence. And eventually, investigators would realize that the killer had left behind something he could never take back: his DNA. The case that once seemed frozen in 1964 was about to cross into the 21st century. But first, investigators had to find the man behind the DNA. And that man had been dead for years.
2.
The morning Catherine Blackburn was supposed to go to work began like any other day. She was expected at the Mohawk Brush Company. A coworker went to her home to pick her up. But there was no answer. No movement. No response from inside. That silence was the first warning. The coworker contacted Catherine's family. Her niece, Sandy Carmichael, went to the house with another family member. What they discovered inside would become one of Albany's most haunting crime scenes. The police were called. Medical personnel arrived. Detectives entered. And a quiet residential home became the center of a homicide investigation that would eventually span generations. Catherine's death was not a simple killing. The injuries indicated extraordinary violence. She had suffered a severe blow to the head, fracturing her skull. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been cut and stabbed. The attack continued with heated kitchen knives, which were used to burn her lips and chest. The brutality immediately suggested that investigators were not dealing with a conventional robbery. There was no clear financial motive. The house had not been burglarized. The killer appeared to have entered for a completely different reason. And that fact made the mystery even more terrifying. Catherine had recently been looking for a tenant. She had advertised the upstairs apartment. At some point, a prospective renter appeared. The person reportedly gave the name Robert Broadhead. A rent receipt was prepared. Then Catherine was murdered. The receipt disappeared. That missing document became one of the strangest pieces of the investigation. Who was Robert Broadhead? Was he a real person? Was it an alias? Was the name deliberately planted? Or had investigators been looking in the wrong direction from the beginning? The mystery surrounding the rental arrangement created an obvious theory. Perhaps the killer had used the advertisement to gain access. Perhaps Catherine had opened her door believing she was meeting someone interested in renting the apartment. If so, the attack may have begun with a deception that required no forced entry. That possibility made the crime even more chilling. The killer may not have broken into Catherine's home. He may have been invited inside. Investigators searched for clues. Among the evidence was a footprint in the yard. There were blood samples. There were papers that investigators believed could have been connected to the killer. And there was the missing receipt. The house itself offered another disturbing detail. The killer apparently had access to the kitchen, the stove, the knives. The environment of the attack was not some remote location. It was Catherine's own home, the place where she should have been safest. Police worked through possible suspects. They examined men who had criminal histories. They looked at people who might have known Catherine. They considered individuals who could have had access to the neighborhood. But the evidence did not produce a clear suspect. There was no confession. No eyewitness who could identify the killer with certainty. No fingerprint that definitively solved the crime. No modern DNA database waiting to provide a name. The case entered a long period of uncertainty. And while the investigation became a cold case, Catherine herself remained present in the memories of those who loved her. Her family remembered more than the crime. She was not simply a victim in a police file. She had been a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a friend, a neighbor, a woman who went to work, a woman who maintained her home, a woman who expected to continue living her ordinary life. That ordinary life was destroyed in a single day, and the person responsible disappeared into history. Decades later, detectives would look back at the original investigation and realize something important. The case had never truly been empty. The evidence was still there. The problem was that science had not yet caught up with it. The sheets, the biological material, the handkerchief, the traces left by a man who believed he had escaped detection. In 1964, those traces were evidence without an answer. In the 21st century, they became a biological message. And that message would eventually point toward Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. But in 1964, nobody knew his name. Not Catherine's family. Not the detectives. Not the newspapers. Not even the investigators who would spend years trying to understand what had happened. Joseph Nowakowski was already living in the same region. He was already accumulating a criminal history. And yet, when Catherine Blackburn was murdered, he was not identified as her killer. That fact would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The man who would eventually be named had been alive. He had been nearby. He had already encountered the criminal justice system. And he would remain free of suspicion in Catherine's murder for more than 6 decades. 3. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski was born in 1931. In September 1964, he was in his early 30s. He was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. His criminal record stretched back years. Authorities later described a history involving burglaries and other offenses. But none of that had connected him to Catherine Blackburn. That distinction matters. The identification made decades later was not the result of an old 1964 confession suddenly being discovered. It was not a witness returning with a perfect memory. It was not a forgotten fingerprint. It was science. And before science could speak, investigators had to preserve the past. For years, the Blackburn case remained in the files. The original evidence survived. That decision, almost invisible at the time, became crucial. Because every year that passed created another obstacle. Witnesses aged.
People died.
Memories faded. Buildings changed. Neighborhoods changed. Records disappeared. But biological evidence could remain. A stain does not forget. A piece of fabric does not forget. DNA does not remember the murder. But it can remember the person who left it behind. The challenge was extracting that information from evidence collected more than half a century earlier. By 2018, Albany Police Detective Melissa Morey encountered the case while working in the department's Forensic Investigative Unit. The file caught her attention. She examined what remained. And what she found was remarkable. The physical evidence had survived. The case was old. But the evidence was not necessarily useless. That realization opened a new chapter. Morey worked with Dr. Christina Lane, a criminologist involved with the Cold Case Analysis Center associated with the College of St. Rose and later Russell Sage College. Together with other investigators and forensic specialists, they began reassessing the evidence. The question was no longer simply, who was Robert Broadhead? The question became, whose biological material was left at the crime scene? And could modern genetic science identify the person behind it? Forensic genealogy offered a new possibility. Traditional DNA matching works best when investigators have a direct comparison. A suspect's DNA. A crime scene DNA profile. 2 samples. One answer. But what happens when the suspect has been dead for decades? What happens when there is no living person in a database whose DNA directly matches the evidence? This is where forensic genetic genealogy can become powerful. Investigators can work from a genetic profile and identify relatives or family connections. The process does not simply produce a name. Researchers build relationships. They construct family trees. They eliminate branches. They compare generations. They examine who could plausibly have been connected to the unknown DNA donor. For Catherine Blackburn's case, the work was slow. It was not a dramatic overnight breakthrough. It took time. According to investigators, the process involved approximately 18 months of work. 18 months. More than a year and a half of tracing biological connections across generations to identify a man who had died in 1998. And that man was Joseph Nowakowski. The name immediately changed the case. But investigators did not stop there. A genealogical lead is not enough. Police needed confirmation. They needed to make sure the DNA connected to the crime scene actually belonged to Nowakowski. That meant confronting an extraordinary logistical problem. Joseph Nowakowski was dead. He could not provide a voluntary DNA sample. He could not be interviewed. He could not be questioned. He could not be arrested. There would be no interrogation room.
No confession.
No courtroom cross-examination. There was only his grave. And investigators now had to determine whether the body buried there still contained the evidence needed to answer a question first asked in 1964. They sought legal authorization. Then, in September 2025, investigators went to Albany Rural Cemetery. The date carried an eerie symmetry. 61 years after Catherine's death, the investigation returned to the past. At approximately 9 a.m. on September 15, 2025, Nowakowski's remains were exhumed. Investigators collected biological samples from his remains, including samples from the femur and arm. The material was sent for testing. And then came the wait. For Catherine's family, it was another moment of uncertainty. They had already waited 61 years. But now the question had become brutally simple. Was Joseph Nowakowski the man whose DNA had been left behind in Catherine Blackburn's home? The answer would determine whether a mystery that had haunted Albany since 1964 could finally be closed.
4.
The most powerful evidence in the Catherine Blackburn case was not found in 2025. It had been sitting there since 1964. A handkerchief. A piece of fabric. An object that, at first glance, could have looked almost meaningless. But beneath Catherine's body, investigators found a handkerchief containing biological material. That material included traces of semen. At the time, investigators could document it. They could preserve it. They could recognize that it might matter. But they could not extract a modern DNA identity from it. The technology simply did not exist. For decades, the handkerchief remained part of the physical history of the crime. The killer had left something behind. But his name remained hidden. Then science changed. DNA profiling transformed homicide investigations. Cases that once depended entirely on witnesses could be revisited. Old biological evidence could be retested. Sometimes, the smallest surviving fragment could reopen an investigation that had been dormant for generations. Catherine's case became one of those investigations. The evidence was subjected to modern forensic analysis. Investigators developed a genetic lead. That lead pointed toward relatives of Joseph Nowakowski. His relatives cooperated with investigators. That cooperation mattered, because the genealogy work had produced a possibility. But investigators wanted certainty. They needed to know whether the man buried at Albany Rural Cemetery was actually the biological source connected to Catherine's crime. That is why the exhumation became so important. The grave was opened. The remains were recovered. Samples were collected. Then the laboratory work began. Imagine the timeline. Catherine is murdered. A handkerchief is collected. The evidence is stored. Years pass.
Nowakowski dies in 1998.
Still no answer. The century changes. A detective reopens the file. The old evidence is examined again. Genetic genealogy begins to transform the investigation. The grave is opened. The DNA is collected. The past is finally placed against the present. And then the laboratory produces the result. The DNA from Nowakowski's remains matched the biological evidence recovered from Catherine's home. The mystery had a name. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. He had died in 1998, 27 years before investigators formally identified him as Catherine's killer. He could never stand trial. But the evidence had finally reached him. The announcement came in October 2025. Albany Police Chief Brendan Cox publicly identified Nowakowski as the man authorities believed responsible for Catherine Blackburn's murder. The language mattered. Police were not simply repeating an old theory. They were presenting the result of a modern forensic investigation. The DNA evidence provided the link, and investigators emphasized that they had taken steps to confirm the identification. They wanted to be certain. They wanted the result to withstand scrutiny. They wanted no possibility that another dead man had been wrongly blamed for one of Albany's most notorious unsolved killings. That caution was understandable. A case that had survived 61 years deserved more than a guess. It deserved proof. The evidence also answered another question. Catherine and Nowakowski apparently did not know each other. Authorities found no indication of a prior relationship. That meant the terrifying possibility remained that Catherine had been attacked by a man who was essentially a stranger. A woman opened the door. A man entered. And somewhere inside that ordinary home, the situation became deadly. The name Robert Broadhead, once one of the most important mysteries in the case, lost its power. Investigators had spent decades wondering who that man was. But modern forensic genealogy pointed somewhere else. The killer was not identified through the name on the missing receipt. He was identified through biology. Through something he could not disguise. Something that could not be destroyed by an alias. Something that remained after every witness was gone. DNA. And that created a haunting reversal. For 61 years, investigators had asked, where is Robert Broadhead? The modern investigation answered a different question. Who left the biological evidence behind? The answer was Joseph Nowakowski. The man who had died nearly 3 decades earlier. The man whose criminal history had once seemed unrelated to Catherine's murder. The man who had escaped suspicion in 1964. And the man who, without knowing it, had carried the secret of Catherine Blackburn's death to his grave.
5.
But the DNA identification did not erase the years that came before it. It could identify a killer. It could not give Catherine back. It could not restore the life that ended in September 1964. And it could not erase what her family had endured. For relatives, a cold case is not an old story. It is an unanswered question that refuses to disappear. Every birthday becomes another reminder. Every family gathering carries an empty space. Every generation learns the same story. Who killed Catherine? Why did it happen? Did the killer know her? Did he follow her? Did he see the rental advertisement? Was the man calling himself Robert Broadhead actually Nowakowski? Or was that name simply another dead end created by the killer's actions? Even after the DNA breakthrough, not every question could be answered. Investigators said there was no evidence that Catherine and Nowakowski knew each other. That finding narrowed one possibility, but deepened another. If they were strangers, then what brought him to her house? The rental advertisement may have provided the opportunity, but the precise sequence of events remains difficult to reconstruct. Catherine had been seeking a tenant. She had apparently shown the apartment to a prospective renter. The name Robert Broadhead appeared on a rent receipt. Then the receipt disappeared. Those facts create a chilling timeline. A woman prepares to rent a room. A stranger appears. A transaction begins. Then violence. And afterward, the stranger vanishes. The original detectives had to work with the information available to them. They searched. They questioned. They followed leads. They examined suspects. But the central problem remained. There was no confirmed identity. The case gradually became part of Albany's criminal history. People grew older. Detectives retired. Some died. The officers who first walked through Catherine's home could never have imagined that the final breakthrough would come after most of them were gone. One investigator associated with the old case was Ted Flint, an Albany police officer whose career later became part of the department's history. Years after the murder, the Blackburn case remained emotionally significant to investigators who had carried it with them. That is one of the defining characteristics of a true cold case. The investigation may become inactive, but it does not necessarily disappear. Somewhere there is still a file. Somewhere there is still evidence. Somewhere someone still remembers the victim. And somewhere, the unanswered question remains. In Catherine's case, that question survived for 6 decades. Then the investigation changed direction. The modern team did not simply reopen the case and start from zero. They used the work of the original detectives. That old evidence became the foundation. The handkerchief, the biological material, the documents, the physical traces, the original scene. Everything collected in 1964 suddenly had new value. This is what makes the Blackburn case more than a story about DNA. It is a story about preservation. If investigators had not carefully preserved the evidence, modern technology might never have had anything to analyze. If the evidence had been discarded, degraded beyond use, or lost, the genealogy breakthrough might never have happened. Instead, the past survived. And when the technology became powerful enough, the evidence began speaking. The investigation also demonstrated why cold cases can remain alive even when no suspect is available. Joseph Nowakowski had been dead since 1998. Yet his death did not erase his biological identity. His remains could still provide a comparison. His relatives could provide genealogical clues. His criminal history could provide context. And the original crime scene evidence could provide the final connection. This is why the case was described by Albany officials as evidence that there is no such thing as a truly dead cold case. Technology can change. Investigative methods can change. New detectives can look at old evidence with new questions. And a clue dismissed or misunderstood decades earlier can suddenly become the most important object in the file. For Catherine's family, however, the science was only one part of the story. The announcement in October 2025 was emotional. Her nieces spoke publicly. Sandy Carmichael, who had discovered Catherine's body decades earlier, was now 81 years old. She had lived almost her entire adult life without knowing who had killed her aunt. Then, finally, she heard the name. Joseph Nowakowski. A name that had been hidden for 61 years. A name attached to a man who was already dead. A name that could not bring Catherine back, but could finally end the question that had haunted her family. And when Carmichael spoke, she did not speak like someone celebrating a victory. She spoke like someone who had finally reached the end of a very long road. She said they had prayed for this day. 61 years. 2 generations. 1 family waiting. 1 victim remembered. 1 piece of evidence refusing to disappear. 6. Joseph Nowakowski's history made the identification even more disturbing. Because although he had never been publicly identified as Catherine Blackburn's killer during the original investigation, his criminal record was not insignificant. Authorities said his local record stretched back to the 1950s. He had been arrested for burglaries. He had been in and out of prison. He had encounters with police involving burglary tools and weapons. Years after Catherine's murder, he would commit another violent attack. In 1973, a 74-year-old woman in Schenectady was attacked in her home. She suffered severe injuries, including a fractured skull and cuts to her back and face. Investigators found clues at the scene: a gold dental crown, a glove. Days later, Nowakowski was arrested following a drunken driving incident and police pursuit. A hatchet found in his vehicle contained blood. The crown was connected to his dental work. The glove was also linked to the crime. He ultimately pleaded guilty to the assault and received a prison sentence of 3 to 15 years. That later crime did not prove the Blackburn murder by itself. But in retrospect, it changed how investigators viewed Nowakowski's history. The man identified through Catherine's DNA was not someone with no prior contact with law enforcement. He had a documented pattern of criminal behavior. He had demonstrated a capacity for violence. And yet, in 1964, he had remained outside the circle of confirmed suspects. That is one of the cruel ironies of the case. Investigators were searching for a murderer. The murderer was living somewhere in the region. But there was no technological bridge connecting him to Catherine. His identity remained hidden behind decades of missing information. And perhaps most importantly, he did not appear to have maintained a relationship with Catherine. Police said there was no indication that the two knew each other. That means the attack may have been opportunistic. But the exact motive remains difficult to establish. Was the rental advertisement the reason he entered? Was the prospective tenant identity genuine? Was Robert Broadhead a pseudonym? Did Nowakowski use it? Or did another person actually appear at Catherine's house under that name? The modern DNA evidence answers the most important question of responsibility, but not necessarily every question of motive and sequence. That distinction matters. Solving a homicide does not always mean reconstructing every second of it. Sometimes science can tell investigators who left evidence behind without explaining exactly what was happening inside the victim's mind or the perpetrator's mind. Catherine's case is one of those. We know what the evidence tells us. We know that she suffered a brutal attack. We know biological evidence was recovered. We know modern forensic genealogy led investigators toward Nowakowski. We know his remains were exhumed. We know DNA from his remains matched the crime scene evidence. And we know authorities identified him in 2025. But the final moments of Catherine's life remain known only through physical evidence and the conclusions investigators can draw from it. That silence is permanent. No interrogation can change it. No courtroom can fill it. No confession can explain it. Nowakowski died in 1998. He took whatever private thoughts he had about Catherine's murder with him. There would be no confession.
No apology. No explanation.
No chance for Catherine's family to look him in the eye. The justice available in 2025 was different. It was forensic. It was historical. It was the simple act of attaching a name to a crime that had remained nameless for 61 years. And that was enough to change the story. For decades, newspapers had described the killer as a stranger. An unknown man. A possible tenant. A person whose name might have been Robert Broadhead. After October 2025, the unknown man had a real identity. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. Born in 1931. Died in 1998. Identified in connection with Catherine's murder in 2025. The timeline itself is almost impossible to comprehend. A man could commit a murder in one century and be identified through DNA in another. The detectives who first investigated the crime were long gone or retired. The victim's family had grown old. The suspect had died. The technology had changed beyond recognition. But the evidence remained. And that evidence became the thread connecting 1964 to 2025. One generation collected it. Another generation analyzed it. A third generation watched the answer emerge. That is the strange mathematics of cold cases. Time does not always destroy the truth. Sometimes it simply delays its arrival. 7. The most haunting object in the case may not have been the weapon. It may have been the handkerchief. A small piece of fabric hidden within the evidence. An object that could have been discarded as insignificant. Instead, it became the biological bridge between Catherine Blackburn and Joseph Nowakowski. The handkerchief contained traces of semen. Those traces survived. Forensic scientists were eventually able to extract usable genetic information. And once the DNA became the focus, the investigation moved into a field that would have been unimaginable to detectives in 1964. Forensic genetic genealogy. The technique relies on the fact that DNA is inherited. A person's genetic profile can reveal biological relationships. A direct match is ideal. But even without one, relatives can provide pathways. Investigators can identify possible family connections and build genealogical trees. Then they work backward and forward through generations. The objective is not to simply search for a surname. It is to identify the individual who could plausibly have contributed the DNA. In Catherine's case, that process was complex. It took approximately 18 months. The investigators had to examine possible relatives and determine which family lines could lead to the unknown biological contributor. That work eventually pointed toward Joseph Nowakowski. But the name alone was not enough. Investigators had to confirm it. And this is where the case took an extraordinary turn. Nowakowski had been dead for 27 years. His remains were buried at Albany Rural Cemetery. If the genetic genealogy hypothesis was correct, his remains could provide the direct comparison. The decision to exhume a body is never trivial. It is a legal and investigative process. Authorities obtained permission. Then they returned to the cemetery. The date was September 15, 2025. The grave was opened. Samples were taken from the remains. Among them were samples from the femur and arm. The samples were sent for analysis. The entire investigation was now reduced to a scientific question. Would the DNA match? If it did, the case would finally have an answer. If it did not, investigators would have to return to the genealogy tree and search again. Weeks later, the result arrived. The DNA matched. The biological evidence from the 1964 crime scene was consistent with DNA from Nowakowski's remains. The unknown man finally had a name. And the name was not Robert Broadhead. It was Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. That result closed a circle that had begun 61 years earlier. But the circle was not completed by one piece of technology alone. It required the preservation of the original evidence. It required investigators willing to reopen the file. It required forensic specialists. It required genealogical research. It required cooperation from Nowakowski's relatives. It required legal authorization to exhume his remains. And it required laboratory testing capable of making the final comparison. Every link mattered. Remove one, and the case might still be unsolved. That is why Catherine Blackburn's case became an important example of modern cold case investigation. It showed what happens when old evidence is treated as something that may still have value. For decades, the evidence was simply old. Then it became new again. The transformation was not physical. The handkerchief did not change. The crime scene did not change. The evidence did not suddenly become more truthful. Science changed. Investigators changed the questions they asked. And suddenly, the old evidence could answer them. There is something almost cruel about that. Catherine's killer had survived the original investigation. He had survived decades of public attention. He had survived the disappearance of witnesses. He had survived the deaths of detectives. He had survived the passage of time. He had even survived his own death. But he did not survive his DNA. That is the part of the story that makes the case feel almost unreal. The killer did everything that time usually does for a murderer. He disappeared. He grew old.
He died.
His grave became part of a cemetery. His name became part of the past. But his biological identity remained. And 61 years after Catherine Blackburn was murdered, that identity was recovered. The announcement did not produce a dramatic courtroom confrontation. There was no suspect sitting at a defense table.
No jury.
No cross-examination.
No sentencing.
The man responsible was already beyond the reach of the justice system. But the identification still mattered. Because Catherine was no longer an unknown victim of an unsolved crime. Her killer had been named. Her family no longer had to wonder whether the person responsible might still be alive. And Albany no longer had to carry the murder as one of its oldest mysteries. The case had moved from uncertainty to historical fact supported by DNA evidence. 61 years after the crime, the question that had once seemed impossible finally had an answer.
8.
Yet there was another question waiting behind the DNA. If Joseph Nowakowski was responsible for Catherine Blackburn's murder, what else might he have done? Authorities were careful. They did not announce that every unsolved crime in the region was suddenly connected to him. But his criminal history created possibilities. He had burglaries in his past. He had weapons. He had been connected to violent conduct. He later attacked an elderly woman with a hatchet. And now forensic evidence tied him to a 1964 homicide of extraordinary brutality. That combination naturally raised questions. Could Nowakowski have been responsible for other crimes? Could he have been involved in cases that remained unsolved? Could there be other victims whose families were still waiting for answers? Police Chief Brendan Cox acknowledged that identifying Nowakowski could potentially help investigators compare his DNA with evidence from other cases. That is one of the most important consequences of solving an old homicide. A suspect's DNA does not necessarily end with one case. Once identified, it can become a reference point. Investigators can ask whether the same biological profile appears elsewhere. A cold case in Albany. A homicide in Schenectady. An assault in another city. A sexual assault decades ago. A missing person investigation with preserved biological evidence. If the evidence survives, a comparison may be possible. But there is a critical distinction between possibility and proof. No additional crime should be attributed to Nowakowski without evidence. The Blackburn case itself demonstrates why. For 61 years, investigators did not know who had left the biological evidence. Now they do. The lesson is not that every old mystery has the same answer. The lesson is that evidence can wait. And when new technology becomes available, old evidence can become extraordinarily valuable. The Blackburn case also exposes one of the greatest weaknesses in traditional investigations. Time destroys human memory. In 1964, witnesses could describe a stranger. But after 10 years, details blur. After 20 years, they become uncertain. After 40 years, many witnesses are gone. After 60 years, almost everyone connected to the original investigation has disappeared from the scene. DNA is different. It does not need to remember. It does not need to sleep. It does not need to rely on a witness recalling the color of a coat or the shape of a face. It simply carries biological information. That is why the handkerchief mattered so much. The killer may have believed that time would erase the crime. Instead, time gave science the opportunity to interpret what he left behind. And there was another irony. Nowakowski had been arrested multiple times during his lifetime. His name existed in law enforcement records. His fingerprints and criminal history were not completely hidden. Yet none of those records had solved Catherine's murder. His identity was known to police in other contexts. But the connection to Catherine was invisible. The missing link was biological. Once that link appeared, the entire history looked different. A career criminal who had once seemed unrelated to a 1964 murder became the central figure. A dead man became a homicide suspect. A cemetery became an investigative location. A decades-old handkerchief became the key. And a case file that had spent years gathering dust became active again. For the people who worked the case, the emotional weight was enormous. Detective Melissa Morey had first encountered the case in 2018. She was not investigating a recent homicide. She was looking backward. She opened an old file and found a story that had never been finished. The physical evidence was still intact. That fact made the case impossible to ignore. Working with Dr. Christina Lane and other partners, investigators pursued the evidence. The process was not glamorous. There were no instant answers. There were family trees, laboratory tests, records,
names,
eliminations, more research, more verification, more waiting. Then the grave. Then the DNA. Then the match. It took years. But the case moved. That is what distinguishes a genuinely solved cold case from a sensational theory. A theory can take minutes. A forensic identification takes evidence. And Catherine Blackburn's family had waited long enough to deserve evidence.
9.
On the day Albany police announced the identification, Catherine Blackburn's nieces stood before cameras. They were not young women anymore. They had spent decades carrying the memory of their aunt. For them, 2025 was not simply another year. It was the year the unknown man finally received a name. Sandy Carmichael had been the person who discovered Catherine's body in 1964.
She was a young woman then.
The memory remained. Now, at 81, she could finally speak publicly about the end of the investigation. Her words carried the weight of 6 decades. She said that evil had entered her aunt's house 61 years earlier. She said it had changed their lives forever. And she said they had prayed for this day. There is something profound about that sentence. Not because it describes a forensic breakthrough, but because it describes what a cold case does to a family. The police may close a file. The newspapers may stop printing the victim's name. The public may forget. But the family continues. They grow older while the case remains the same age. A photograph remains frozen in time. A voice is remembered. A favorite habit. A family story. A chair that nobody wants to move. Then decades pass. Children become adults. Adults become grandparents. And somewhere in the middle of all those years, the victim's name can become something that only the family remembers. Catherine's family refused to let that happen. Her name survived. The case survived. The evidence survived. And eventually, the investigation survived. The October 2025 announcement was therefore not simply the identification of a suspect. It was a restoration of Catherine's place in the story. She was no longer merely the victim of an unsolved 1964 homicide. She became the woman at the center of a case that demonstrated the power of persistence. The investigation had crossed generations. The first detectives could not solve it. The next generation could not solve it. But the investigators who returned to the evidence decades later finally found the missing connection. That connection was DNA. And DNA does not care how old a case is. It does not care how many headlines have disappeared. It does not care whether the suspect is alive. It does not care whether the original detectives are still working. It can wait. That is the haunting lesson of the Blackburn case. The passage of time did not destroy the evidence. It only delayed the moment when the evidence could speak. The original investigators had collected blood. They had recorded footprints. They had examined documents. They had searched for the mysterious renter. They had pursued suspects. They had preserved material that could not yet provide a name. Modern investigators inherited all of it. They did not need to reinvent the crime. They needed to listen differently. The forensic genealogy investigation eventually produced a lead. Nowakowski's relatives helped investigators move from possibility toward confirmation. Then the exhumation provided the direct test. The result was positive. The biological evidence matched. And with that, the longest silence in the case was broken. But another silence remained. Joseph Nowakowski could not explain himself. He could not answer questions. He could not tell investigators whether Robert Broadhead was an alias he used. He could not explain why he targeted Catherine. He could not reveal whether anyone else knew what happened. He could not identify every movement he made on that September day. He could not apologize. The dead cannot confess. They can only leave evidence. And sometimes that evidence speaks more clearly than a confession ever could. For Catherine's family, the absence of a confession may always leave a final gap. But the most important question had been answered. Who killed Catherine Blackburn? Authorities say the evidence identifies Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The man died in 1998. Catherine died in 1964. Their lives crossed for a brief and terrible period. Then they separated for more than 6 decades. The final connection was made in a laboratory, not a courtroom, not a confession room, not a police interrogation. A laboratory. That is how the story of Catherine Blackburn finally reached its conclusion. Not with a dramatic arrest, but with a DNA match.
10.
There is a strange geography to a cold case. The locations remain. The streets remain. The houses may change. The people disappear. But the place remembers. Colony Street was an ordinary part of Albany. In 1964, Catherine Blackburn's home stood there. A well-kept property. A window box. Pink and white petunias. Nothing about the setting announced that one of Albany's most disturbing murders was about to occur there. That is often how these cases begin. Not with darkness. Not with a warning. But with normality. A woman goes to work. A coworker expects to pick her up. A family member expects to hear from her. An advertisement seeks a tenant. A stranger arrives. A door opens. And the ordinary world ends. The next day, police stand outside. Neighbors watch. Investigators enter. A family is shattered. The house becomes evidence. And the life that existed there becomes part of a crime scene. For years afterward, people could walk past the address without knowing what had happened. But Catherine's family knew. The investigators knew. And somewhere in the archives, the case file waited. The crime became part of Albany's history. It was mentioned in newspapers. It was revisited by investigators. It was remembered by retired officers. At one point, investigators considered notorious names, including men associated with other high-profile crimes. But none of those theories produced the answer. The case remained unresolved. Then, in 2018, the file was opened again. That moment was small. A detective looked at an old case. But small decisions can have enormous consequences. If Maury had never opened the file, the case might have remained untouched. If the evidence had not been preserved, the genealogy work might have failed. If the biological material had degraded beyond analysis, the mystery might have survived another generation. If Nowakowski's relatives had not cooperated, the investigation could have stalled. If investigators had not obtained permission to exhume his remains, the identification might have remained a genealogical theory. Every stage depended on persistence. And that is why the story is not simply about a killer. It is about everyone who refused to let Catherine's case disappear. The original detectives, the evidence technicians, the later investigators, the forensic researchers, the genealogists, the family members, the relatives of the suspect who cooperated. Each played a role in bringing the case to its final answer. The final confirmation came in 2025. Investigators compared DNA from Nowakowski's exhumed remains with the biological evidence recovered from the 1964 crime scene. The result matched. A case that had survived 61 years was finally resolved. But resolution does not mean restoration. There is no technology capable of returning Catherine to her family. There is no forensic breakthrough capable of reversing the decades. There is no court sentence because the suspect died long ago. There is no interrogation transcript explaining the motive. There is only the truth that can be established from evidence. And sometimes that truth is enough to close one door. The door to uncertainty. For Catherine's family, the question is no longer open. They know who authorities believe killed her. They know the suspect's name. They know that the evidence survived. They know that investigators never completely abandoned the case. And they know that the man responsible did not escape the reach of forensic science forever. He escaped the detectives of 1964. He escaped the investigators of later decades. He escaped the possibility of arrest during his lifetime. But he did not escape the evidence. That is perhaps the most powerful image left by the case. Aggrave. A laboratory. A handkerchief. A DNA profile. A name. And 61 years of silence collapsing in a matter of weeks. The story began with a woman who was supposed to go to work. It ended with investigators identifying a dead man. Between those two moments lies 6 decades of grief, uncertainty, technological change, and persistence. Catherine Blackburn was killed in a world without modern DNA databases. Her killer was identified in a world where genealogy and forensic genetics can reach across generations. That difference is the reason this case was finally solved. But the emotional core has not changed. A family lost someone they loved. They waited. They remembered. They hoped. And eventually the answer came. 11. For 61 years, Catherine Blackburn's murder was a question without an answer. The question survived because her family survived. It survived because investigators preserved the evidence. It survived because someone eventually opened the file again. And it survived because one small piece of biological evidence refused to disappear. Today, the name Joseph Stanley Nowakowski is permanently connected to the case. He was 33 when Catherine was killed. He died in 1998. He was not publicly identified as her killer during his lifetime. But in 2025, after investigators exhumed his remains and compared his DNA with biological evidence preserved from Catherine's home, authorities said the match confirmed his connection to the crime. The man who had been invisible for 61 years finally had a name. And Catherine Blackburn finally had an answer. But the final image is not the suspect. It is Catherine. A woman whose life was larger than the crime committed against her. A woman who worked. A woman who maintained her home. A woman who cared about family. A woman who was planning to rent an apartment. A woman whose ordinary day became the final day of her life. For decades, the details of her murder threatened to become the only thing people remembered. But her family remembered more. They remembered Aunt Kate. They remembered her faith. They remembered her relationships. They remembered the woman she had been before the headlines. That is what makes the conclusion of the case so important. A cold case can turn a person into a date, a name, A crime scene. A newspaper headline. But Catherine was never just a 1964 homicide victim. She was a person whose life existed before the killer entered her home. And after 61 years, her family was finally able to separate her memory from the unanswered question. The question had been, who did this? The answer, according to the DNA evidence and Albany investigators, was Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. But another question remains for every cold case. How many more victims are still waiting? How many pieces of evidence are sitting inside evidence rooms? How many handkerchiefs, blood-stained fabrics, biological samples, photographs, fingerprints, documents, and objects have survived from crimes that were never solved? How many families have spent decades wondering whether anyone still remembers? Catherine Blackburn's case provides a reason to keep looking. The technology of 1964 could not solve it. The technology of 1984 could not solve it. The technology of 2004 could not solve it. But the investigators of 2018 asked a different question. And the science of 2025 finally had the ability to answer. That is the nature of a cold case.
It is not necessarily dead.
It may simply be waiting for the right method. The Blackburn investigation also carries a warning. Time is not always the ally of a killer. Sometimes time becomes the ally of the victim. Every year brings new forensic tools, new databases, new methods of DNA analysis, new ways to reconstruct family relationships, new opportunities to revisit evidence that once seemed impossible to interpret. The killer may be dead. The witness may be gone. The detective may have retired. But the evidence may still be there. Catherine's evidence was. And when investigators finally found the right way to read it, the past opened. 61 years disappeared. For one moment, 1964 and 2025 became the same investigation. A woman was murdered. A biological trace was left behind. A suspect lived. A suspect died. A family waited. Scientists worked. Investigators followed the evidence. And eventually a name emerged. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. No courtroom could hear his confession. No judge could pronounce a sentence. No prison cell would receive him. But history now carries his name alongside Catherine Blackburn's murder. And Catherine's family no longer has to wonder whether the killer was still somewhere out there. The uncertainty is gone. The silence has been broken. The evidence has spoken. For 61 years, the case waited. Then finally DNA answered. And somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the police files, beyond the cemetery and the laboratory, there remains one simple truth. Catherine Blackburn was not forgotten. Her family did not stop remembering. Investigators did not stop looking. And the man who believed the passage of time had buried his secret discovered, more than half a century later, that the evidence had been waiting all along. The house became quiet. The newspapers stopped printing her name. The detectives moved on. The suspect died. The decades passed. But the evidence remained. And in the end, that was enough. 61 years after Catherine Blackburn's death, the oldest question in the case finally had an answer. The killer was no longer unknown. The cold case was no longer cold. And Catherine Blackburn's name could finally be spoken not only as the name of a woman whose life was violently taken, but as the name of a woman whose story survived long enough for the truth to find her. The name Joseph Stanley Nowakowski had finally surfaced, but for Catherine Blackburn's family, the revelation did not bring a simple ending. It opened a door onto a past they had spent more than half a century trying not to relive. For 61 years, the question had been brutally simple. Who killed Catherine? Now investigators had an answer. But another question immediately followed. What exactly happened inside that house on Colony Street on September 13, 1964? The surviving evidence could tell only part of the story. It could establish violence. It could establish the presence of a man. It could establish the biological connection that ultimately led investigators to Nowakowski. But it could not reconstruct every movement, every word, every moment of fear. That silence is one of the most disturbing features of the case. Catherine had been living an ordinary life. She worked as a supervisor at the Mohawk Brush Company. She was known to her family as someone dependable, someone who maintained her routines, someone who did not appear to be living under any obvious threat. Nothing suggested that she was about to become the victim of one of Albany's most brutal unsolved murders. And yet someone came to her home. Investigators believed the rental advertisement was significant. Catherine had been attempting to rent the upstairs portion of her house. That meant strangers could have a legitimate reason to approach her door. A prospective tenant would not necessarily have appeared suspicious. He could knock, introduce himself, ask questions, look around, discuss rent, and leave without attracting attention. But the man who entered Catherine's world that day did not leave peacefully. The identity attached to the rental transaction was Robert Broadhead. For years, that name haunted the investigation. Was Robert Broadhead real? Was he an alias? Was he the person who entered Catherine's home? Or was the name connected to someone completely unrelated to the murder? The missing receipt only intensified the mystery. Investigators knew that a document had existed. They knew a name had been written, but the physical receipt itself was gone. That was not the only strange clue. Investigators discovered that pressure marks had been left on another sheet of paper. By examining those impressions, they were able to reconstruct writing that had been made on a page above it. It was an old-fashioned forensic technique, painstaking and uncertain, but in a case without modern DNA, every fragment mattered. The reconstructed writing pointed back toward the name Robert Broadhead. But the name did not lead to a confirmed suspect. Instead, it became another dead end. And while investigators chased the identity of the mysterious renter, the crime scene itself was telling a different story. Catherine had suffered a catastrophic assault. The violence was so extreme that it was difficult to understand why the killer had continued after she was already incapacitated. She had been struck in the head. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been cut and stabbed. Her body had also been burned with heated knives. This was not a crime that ended quickly. The evidence suggested rage, brutality, or some other motive that investigators could not fully reconstruct. And that uncertainty mattered. A murderer who kills quickly may be motivated by robbery, panic, or an attempt to silence a witness. But a murderer who continues attacking a helpless victim presents investigators with a different problem. What was driving him? Was Catherine specifically targeted? Or was she simply the woman who happened to open the door? For decades, investigators could not answer. Then there was the question of the house itself. Why was Catherine not simply robbed? Why was valuable property apparently left behind? Why was there no obvious explanation for the attack? The absence of a clear financial motive made the case more disturbing. If the killer had entered for money, investigators might have expected evidence of searching, theft, or a hurried escape. Instead, they were confronted with a crime that seemed personal even though there was no established relationship between Catherine and her attacker. That contradiction remained unresolved. And this was where the name Nowakowski would eventually change everything. Because modern investigators did not need to prove what they could not know. They needed to establish who had left the biological evidence. That evidence had been collected in 1964. The killer had unknowingly left behind a biological signature.
He could use another name.
He could disappear. He could move. He could eventually die. But his DNA remained connected to the evidence.
That is why the case survived.
Not because investigators had a perfect theory. Not because witnesses remembered everything. Not because the killer made a dramatic mistake immediately after the crime. The case survived because the physical evidence survived. For decades, That evidence was trapped inside the limitations of forensic science. Then the technology changed. By the time Detective Melissa Morey began examining the case in 2018, DNA technology had transformed the investigation of old murders. Cold cases were no longer limited to fingerprints and eyewitnesses. Genetic genealogy had created a new pathway. Instead of asking whether a DNA profile directly matched someone already known to police, investigators could ask a much larger question. Who in the population could be biologically related to the person who left this DNA? That question expanded the investigation from one suspect to an entire family tree. And somewhere inside that tree was a branch leading toward Joseph Nowakowski. But finding the branch was only the beginning. Investigators still had to prove that the man at the end of it was the same man responsible for Catherine's murder. Nowakowski was already dead. He had died in 1998. That meant there would be no arrest. No interview.
No confession.
No opportunity to test his story against the evidence. The only way to obtain direct confirmation was to recover his DNA. And that meant going to the cemetery. In September 2025, investigators arrived at Albany Rural Cemetery. More than 6 decades had passed since Catherine's death. The grave of the man they now suspected was about to be opened. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A murder committed in 1964 had sent investigators into a cemetery in 2025. The dead man could not object. He could not answer.
He could not explain.
His remains were the only remaining source of direct biological evidence. Samples were taken, including material from the femur and arm. Then the laboratory comparison began. The entire investigation had narrowed to a single question. Did the DNA from Joseph Nowakowski match the biological material preserved from Catherine Blackburn's murder? If the answer was no, the genealogy trail would have to be reconsidered. If the answer was yes, 61 years of uncertainty would collapse. The result was a match. That moment changed the status of the case forever. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski was identified by Albany authorities as the man responsible for Catherine Blackburn's murder. But the confirmation also created an eerie realization. Nowakowski had been dead for 27 years when investigators named him. He had already lived out his final years. He had already been buried. His family had already known him as part of their own history. And somewhere among those memories was a secret no one could prove. Until the DNA. That is what makes the Blackburn case so haunting. The killer did not suddenly confess. He did not make a mistake in 2025. He did not leave a new clue. The clue had been there since the beginning. It was investigators who finally learned how to read it. And once they did, the past became visible again. The old handkerchief was no longer merely evidence from a 1964 homicide. It became the biological link to a man who had spent decades beyond the reach of the investigation. The old file was no longer a collection of unanswered questions. It became a map. A map that led from Catherine's home to a name. From a name to a family. From a family to a grave. And from that grave to DNA. But even after the identification, one final mystery remained. Why Catherine? Why that house? Why that day? Why such extraordinary violence? Those questions may never be answered. Joseph Nowakowski cannot tell investigators. The people who knew the circumstances in 1964 have largely disappeared. And the only person who could potentially explain the final moments was the one person who will never speak. The evidence can establish his connection. It cannot reveal his thoughts. That is the cruel limitation of solving a murder after the suspect is dead. Justice can identify. Science can confirm. History can record. But none of them can restore the missing conversation. Catherine's family will never hear what happened from the killer himself. They will never know whether he planned the attack before he arrived. They may never know whether the rental advertisement was deliberately used to gain access. They may never know what the name Robert Broadhead truly meant. And they may never know whether Nowakowski had watched Catherine before entering the house, or whether the encounter began as something entirely different. Those questions remain suspended in 1964. But one question no longer is. The unknown man has a name. And after 61 years, Catherine Blackburn is no longer waiting for investigators to tell her family who killed her. They finally have an answer. The answer came from a piece of evidence that had been silent for more than 6 decades. A piece of evidence the killer never knew would survive him. A piece of evidence that outlived the detectives, the headlines, the investigation, and even the man who left it behind. DNA. And in the end, that was the thing time could not erase. The first investigators who entered Catherine Blackburn's home in September 1964 could not have imagined that the evidence surrounding them would still matter 61 years later. They were working in a world without genetic genealogy, without searchable DNA databases, without the forensic technology that would eventually transform the investigation. They had notebooks, cameras, fingerprints, blood samples, witness statements, footprints, handwritten documents, and the instincts of detectives who knew that every object inside the house might matter. But there was one thing they did not have. They did not have a way to ask the evidence who had left it behind. That limitation would define the case for decades. The house on Colony Street had become a crime scene almost overnight. Catherine's body had been discovered after she failed to appear for work. The circumstances were so violent that investigators immediately understood they were dealing with something far more serious than a burglary gone wrong. There was no obvious explanation for the attack.
No straightforward theft.
No clear personal connection between victim and killer. And no reliable witness who could point toward a specific man and say, with certainty, that he was the person responsible. Instead, detectives were left with fragments. A possible tenant. A suspicious name. A missing receipt. A footprint.
Blood.
Biological material. And a handkerchief that would become one of the most important objects in the entire investigation. In 1964, biological evidence could establish certain facts, but it could not produce the kind of genetic identity that modern investigators take for granted. Investigators could recognize semen. They could preserve it. They could document it. They could understand that it might someday become important. But someday was a very long way away. For Catherine's family, the investigation did not feel like a scientific puzzle. It was personal. Her niece, Sandy Carmichael, would later describe the discovery of Catherine's body and the effect it had on the family. The image of that day never disappeared. It remained in memory while the case slowly disappeared from public attention. That is what happens with many cold cases. The first weeks are filled with headlines. The first months are filled with interviews. The first year is filled with speculation. Then the calls become less frequent. The detectives move to other cases. The newspapers find new stories. And eventually the murder becomes a file. But Catherine's family did not have the luxury of forgetting. Every year carried another reminder that the person responsible had never been identified. The killer had walked away. That fact alone could haunt a family. But there was another possibility that made the situation even worse. What if the killer was still alive? What if he was living somewhere nearby? What if he had built a normal life? What if people who knew him had no idea what he had done? Those questions had no answers. And then the years began to accumulate. 10 years.
20.
30.
40.
By the time Catherine's murder reached its 50th anniversary, the original investigation belonged almost entirely to history. The officers who had worked the case were aging.
Some were gone.
The witnesses were aging too. Some had died. The physical world had changed. The neighborhood changed. The city changed. But the evidence remained. And that became the most important fact of all. In 2018, Detective Melissa Morey encountered the case while working with Albany police. The file immediately presented an unusual opportunity. Unlike some old homicide investigations, the Blackburn case still contained physical evidence that could potentially be examined with modern forensic techniques. The question became whether the biological material could produce a usable DNA profile. If it could, investigators might finally have something the original detectives never possessed: a genetic identity. But even a usable profile would not automatically reveal a name. The police still needed a path from DNA to a person. Traditional DNA matching would have required the suspect's profile to already exist in an accessible database. But what if the suspect had never been tested? What if he had never been arrested for an offense requiring DNA collection? What if he was dead? What if the only people who carried parts of his genetic legacy were his descendants and relatives? That is where forensic genetic genealogy entered the story. The science sounds simple when reduced to a headline. DNA identifies killer. But the actual process is far more complicated. Investigators begin with genetic information extracted from the evidence. They search for biological relationships. They examine distant relatives. They construct family trees. They compare dates, locations, ages, and known histories. They eliminate people who could not possibly have contributed the DNA. It is part forensic science, part genealogy, part historical investigation, and part detective work. In Catherine's case, the process did not produce an immediate answer. It took approximately 18 months. For the family, those months must have felt like another extension of the 61-year wait. The investigation was moving, but moving slowly. There were names that could lead nowhere, family branches that had to be examined, connections that had to be verified, and every potential identification needed confirmation. Eventually, the investigation pointed toward Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The name was significant, not because it appeared on the original rental receipt. It did not solve the mystery of Robert Broadhead. Instead, it emerged from biology. That difference is crucial. The original investigation had been built around human testimony and physical clues. The modern investigation was built around genetic relationships. Nowakowski had been born in 1931. He was approximately 33 years old when Catherine was killed. He was therefore within the age range investigators might have considered plausible in 1964. But the genealogy lead alone was not enough. Police needed direct DNA confirmation. And there was an enormous obstacle. Joseph Nowakowski was dead. He had died in 1998. That meant investigators could not simply ask him to provide a sample. They could not confront him with the evidence. They could not watch his reaction. They could not hear a denial. They could not listen for a confession. The investigation had to continue without the one person who could potentially answer every question. His grave became the next destination. In September 2025, investigators obtained authorization to exhume Nowakowski's remains from Albany Rural Cemetery. More than 6 decades after Catherine's death, the investigation returned to the dead. The cemetery was quiet. The case was not. Investigators recovered samples from Nowakowski's remains, including material from the femur and arm. Those samples were taken to the laboratory. The moment was extraordinary. A man who had died 27 years earlier was about to be scientifically connected to a crime committed 61 years earlier. The timeline seemed almost impossible. Catherine was murdered in 1964. Nowakowski died in 1998. Detectives reopened the case in 2018. The grave was opened in 2025. And finally, the DNA evidence provided the connection. The result matched the biological evidence recovered from Catherine's crime scene. The unknown contributor was no longer unknown. The name was Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. But as soon as the identification became public, another part of the story came into focus. Nowakowski had not lived an anonymous life. His criminal history had already placed him on law enforcement's radar. He had been involved in burglaries.
He had served time.
He had later been connected to a violent attack against an elderly woman. That later case would become particularly disturbing when investigators looked back at it through the lens of the Blackburn identification. In 1973, a 74-year-old Schenectady woman was violently assaulted inside her home. She suffered serious injuries. Investigators recovered physical evidence, including a glove and a dental crown. Nowakowski was later arrested following a drunken driving incident and police pursuit. Evidence connected him to the assault. He eventually pleaded guilty and received a prison sentence. That crime occurred 9 years after Catherine's murder. At the time, there was no known connection between the two cases. But now investigators knew something they did not know in 1973. Nowakowski's DNA was connected to Catherine's murder. The later assault did not itself prove that he had committed Catherine's killing, but it provided context. It showed that the man identified through Catherine's DNA had demonstrated violent behavior years after her death. And it raised an unsettling question. How many times had he crossed the line between criminal behavior and lethal violence? The answer remains uncertain. Investigators cannot simply assign every unsolved crime to a newly identified suspect. Every case requires evidence. Every connection requires proof. And Catherine's case is powerful precisely because the DNA evidence is so specific. It does not merely say Nowakowski was capable of violence. It connects his biological identity to evidence recovered from the scene. That is the difference between suspicion and forensic identification. For 6 decades, investigators had theories. In 2025, they had DNA. Yet the most painful mystery remains. What happened in Catherine's house during those final moments? The evidence tells us she was attacked with extraordinary brutality. But it does not give us her final thoughts. It cannot tell us whether she recognized the man. It cannot tell us whether she tried to negotiate with him. It cannot tell us whether she realized immediately that she was in danger. It cannot tell us what she thought when she understood that the person standing inside her home was no longer a prospective tenant, but an attacker. Those moments belong only to Catherine. And they disappeared with her. That is the boundary that even modern forensic science cannot cross. DNA can identify a person. It cannot restore a voice. It cannot reconstruct every thought. It cannot give a family the final conversation they never had. But it can do something extraordinary. It can prevent a victim from remaining nameless. For 61 years, Catherine Blackburn's murder was an open wound in Albany. Now the wound had finally been given an explanation. Not every question. Not every detail. But the central question. Who was responsible? Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. A man who had been dead for nearly 3 decades. A man whose name had never appeared as the definitive answer in the original investigation. A man who could no longer be arrested. But a man whose biological signature had remained behind. That signature outlived him. It outlived the original detectives. It outlived the headlines. It outlived the investigation. And eventually, it outlived the secret itself. The killer believed in the power of time. Time would erase witnesses. Time would bury memories. Time would close the file. Time would eventually put everyone connected to the case in the ground. But time also preserved the evidence. And that is the final irony. The same decades that seemed to protect Catherine's killer ultimately helped investigators find him. 61 years passed. The world changed. The science changed.
The people changed.
But the evidence remained. Waiting.
Silent.
Until someone finally knew how to listen. The DNA had spoken, but DNA alone could not tell the entire story. It could identify the biological source of evidence, It could connect a dead man to a crime scene. It could transform a name from a genealogical possibility into a forensic conclusion. But it could not explain the darkness that unfolded inside Catherine Blackburn's home in 1964. For that, investigators had to return to the beginning. Back to the house. Back to the woman who had opened her door. Back to the mysterious tenant. Back to the name Robert Broadhead. And back to the terrifying possibility that Catherine may have unknowingly invited her own killer inside. The rental advertisement was one of the strangest elements of the case because it provided a perfectly ordinary reason for a stranger to approach Catherine. She was looking for someone to rent the upstairs apartment. That meant a man could knock on her door without immediately appearing suspicious. A prospective tenant was expected. A stranger could become a visitor. A visitor could become an attacker. And if that was what happened, the killer did not need to force his way into Catherine's home. He only needed Catherine to believe his story. That possibility would become even more disturbing after investigators eventually identified Nowakowski. Because if he had used the rental opportunity to gain access, then the murder may have begun with a calculated deception. A false identity. A false purpose. A normal conversation that concealed something much darker. The name Robert Broadhead remained part of the mystery for years. Investigators found a rent receipt bearing the name, but the receipt itself disappeared. That missing document became almost symbolic of the entire investigation. Something existed. Something important had been recorded. Then it vanished. Yet the impression of writing remained on another sheet of paper. Investigators examined the pressure marks. They reconstructed the writing. The name emerged again. Robert Broadhead. But when investigators searched for a man who fit that identity, they could not establish a clear connection to the murder. The name was real enough to appear in the evidence, but it did not lead them to the killer. That left detectives facing a terrible possibility. The man who killed Catherine may have deliberately hidden behind a false name. If so, the investigation had been chasing a shadow. And shadows do not leave fingerprints on a database. They do not appear in a suspect lineup. They disappear. That is what happened here. The investigation continued. Detectives interviewed people. They examined Catherine's personal life. They investigated possible motives. They looked at men who might have had access to her. They explored the possibility that the murder was connected to other crimes. But the evidence never aligned strongly enough to produce an arrest. The killer remained unidentified. Meanwhile, Catherine's family had to live with the details of what had happened. The brutality of the crime was not something that could simply be forgotten. Her injuries told investigators that she had endured an extraordinary level of violence. She had been struck in the head. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been cut and stabbed. Heated knives had been used to burn her. The violence suggested that the attack had become something far beyond a simple confrontation. And because Catherine was found inside her own home, the crime also destroyed the family's sense of safety. Home is supposed to be the final barrier between a person and the outside world. A locked door. A familiar hallway. A kitchen. A bedroom. Objects that belong to you. Places where you know every sound. But Catherine's home became the location where her life ended. That fact would remain one of the most painful parts of the case. Investigators could leave the crime scene. Catherine's family could eventually leave the house. But nobody could leave the memory behind. Years later, when detectives returned to the file, the original scene photographs and evidence became a bridge to that lost world. The photographs preserved the condition of the house. The evidence preserved the physical traces. The documents preserved fragments of the investigation. And the handkerchief preserved something far more important. The killer's DNA. The object may have seemed ordinary. A piece of fabric. Something that could have been discarded. But it became the most important witness in the entire case. It could not speak. It could not describe the killer's face. It could not tell investigators where he had come from. But it carried biological information. That information survived for decades. And when the case was reopened, it became the foundation of the genetic investigation. Detective Melissa Morey was one of the investigators who recognized that the old evidence still had potential. In 2018, she encountered Catherine's case while working with Albany police. The murder had remained unresolved for more than 5 decades. But Morey and other investigators did not treat the age of the case as a reason to abandon it. They treated it as a reason to look at it differently. The first generation had asked who Robert Broadhead was. The new generation asked who left the DNA. That was a fundamental change. Instead of following the old theory, investigators followed the biological evidence. And that evidence led them away from the name that had dominated the original investigation. It led toward Nowakowski. The genealogy process took approximately 18 months. That meant months of searching. Months of comparing family connections. Months of examining historical records. Months of eliminating possibilities. And months of resisting the temptation to declare victory too early. A cold case cannot afford a premature conclusion. One wrong assumption can send investigators down another dead end. One incorrect family connection can produce a false suspect. One mistaken identity can reopen an old wound for an innocent family. So investigators needed confirmation. They needed Nowakowski's DNA. But Nowakowski was dead. That forced the investigation into one of the most unusual stages of the case. The cemetery. Albany Rural Cemetery had become the final resting place of the man investigators believed was connected to Catherine's murder. On September 15, 2025, authorities exhumed his remains. The act itself carried enormous weight. A grave that had been closed for decades was opened because of a murder committed more than 60 years earlier. The remains were recovered. Samples were collected. And the investigators waited for the laboratory. For Catherine's family, this was another moment of uncertainty. The genealogy evidence had pointed toward Nowakowski. But until the direct DNA comparison was completed, there was still a possibility that the lead could fail. The entire case had narrowed to biology. The result eventually came back. The DNA matched. And the old murder suddenly had a definitive biological connection. The man who had remained outside the investigation for so long was finally identified. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. But the identification also forced investigators to confront another uncomfortable fact. The man they had spent years searching for had already been dead for decades. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. There would be no sentence. There would be no chance for prosecutors to present the evidence before a jury. There would be no opportunity for a judge to hear the family describe the loss. And there would be no possibility of asking Nowakowski why. That final question may remain unanswered forever. Why Catherine? Why such violence? Why enter her home? Why attack her? Why continue? Why leave biological evidence behind? The DNA can answer one question. It cannot answer all the others. This is the paradox of solving a homicide after the suspect's death. The truth can be established without the full story ever being known. Investigators can say who the evidence points to, but they may never know what motivated him. And that means Catherine's case is both solved and incomplete. Solved because the biological evidence identifies the man authorities say was responsible. Incomplete because the central human questions remain unanswered. That distinction matters to the family. A name is powerful, but a name is not an explanation. Catherine's relatives spent 61 years waiting for the name. Now they have it. But they will never hear the reason. They will never know whether the attack was planned. They will never know how long the killer had been watching her. They will never know whether the rental advertisement was the exact reason he approached her. They will never know whether Robert Broadhead was an alias used by Nowakowski or simply a misleading piece of evidence. And they will never hear the killer explain what happened. The only testimony left is physical. The handkerchief. The DNA. The evidence collected in 1964. The remains recovered in 2025. And the laboratory result connecting them. Part 7. That is enough for investigators. But for a family, the silence can feel endless. Still, something changed in 2025. For the first time, Catherine's family could stop wondering whether the killer had escaped. He had not escaped. He had simply died before the truth caught up with him. His grave did not erase the crime. His death did not erase the evidence. And 61 years of silence did not erase Catherine's name. Instead, the passage of time became the very thing that allowed the investigation to reach its conclusion. The killer had counted on time. But time carried the evidence forward. And eventually the evidence found him. The old case file had become a message from 1964 to investigators in 2025. It said, "Look again." The answer is still here. And once they looked again, they finally saw it. The name Joseph Stanley Nowakowski had finally emerged from the shadows, but identifying him did not erase the strange, unanswered details that had surrounded Catherine Blackburn's murder since 1964. In fact, the DNA breakthrough forced investigators and the public to look back at the original crime with a completely different understanding. For decades, Robert Broadhead had been one of the most mysterious names in the case. Now, there was another name. Now there was biological evidence. Now there was a man whose criminal history could be examined against the facts investigators had collected more than 6 decades earlier. And suddenly, details that had once seemed disconnected began to look different. But there was a danger in looking backward. Investigators could not simply rewrite history because they knew the ending. They had to separate what was known in 1964 from what became known in 2025. That distinction is critical. The detectives who first investigated Catherine's murder did not know about Nowakowski's later criminal history. They did not know his DNA would eventually be recoverable. They did not know genetic genealogy would exist. They did not know that investigators decades later would be able to construct a biological family tree from a crime scene sample. They were working with what they had. And what they had was a horrifying crime, a missing receipt, a mysterious name, physical evidence, and a victim whose killer appeared to have vanished. The first challenge was understanding Catherine herself. She was not someone living on the margins of society. She worked. She had responsibilities. She maintained a home. She had family. She had routines. There was nothing about her life that suggested she was expecting danger. That made the murder even more shocking. A violent crime committed against someone in a familiar environment creates a particular kind of fear. Neighbors begin looking differently at their own doors. Families begin wondering who can be trusted. A stranger walking down the street suddenly seems more significant. A knock at the door becomes something to think about. In Catherine's case, the possibility that the killer gained entry under the pretense of being a prospective tenant made that fear even sharper. A person looking for an apartment does not have to break a window. He does not have to force a lock. He does not have to climb through a window. He simply has to knock. That possibility remained one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Catherine had been trying to rent the upstairs apartment. The arrangement should have been ordinary. A prospective tenant asks questions. A homeowner answers them. They discuss money. They discuss space. Perhaps they discuss when the apartment might become available. And then the meeting ends. But Catherine's meeting ended differently. Her life ended. The crime scene indicated that she had been violently attacked. The injuries were severe. The evidence of sexual assault added another layer of brutality. And the use of heated knives made the attack even more disturbing. Investigators had to consider what kind of person could commit such an act. But personality profiling in 1964 was limited. Detectives could look at behavior. They could examine criminal records. They could interview acquaintances. They could search for suspicious men. But they could not see into the future. They could not know that 9 years later, a man named Joseph Nowakowski would be connected to another violent home invasion. That later crime became important only after the DNA identification. In 1973, a 74-year-old woman in Schenectady was attacked in her home. She suffered serious injuries. The crime was violent. Investigators collected evidence. Nowakowski eventually came under suspicion and was arrested after a separate incident involving drunken driving and a police pursuit. A hatchet found in his vehicle contained blood. A dental crown connected him to the victim. A glove was also linked to the crime. He ultimately pleaded guilty and was sentenced to prison. The 1973 case did not solve Catherine's murder. It could not. But history now contained a disturbing coincidence. A man later convicted of a violent home attack had lived through the same era as Catherine's murder. He had been in the region. He had a criminal record. And his DNA would eventually be found connected to Catherine's crime scene. The coincidence became evidence only when the DNA arrived. Before that, it was merely another crime. Afterward, it became part of Nowakowski's history. That is how cold case investigations often work. A fact that once seems irrelevant can become important when new information changes the context. But investigators have to be careful. Context is not proof. The fact that Nowakowski committed another violent crime does not, by itself, establish that he killed Catherine. The DNA does. That is why the exhumation was so important. Genealogy can point. DNA can confirm. Investigators needed both. The genealogy work had identified Nowakowski as a possible source. Then the exhumation provided the direct comparison. The grave at Albany Rural Cemetery became the bridge between the theory and the evidence. The remains were recovered. Samples were taken. And the laboratory confirmed the match. That result transformed the investigation. For the first time, investigators could publicly identify a man as the source of the biological evidence connected to Catherine's murder. But there was another important consequence. Nowakowski's death meant that investigators could never ask him about the crime. They could not place the evidence in front of him. They could not ask whether he knew Catherine. They could not ask whether he used the name Robert Broadhead. They could not ask whether he had planned the attack. They could not ask whether anyone helped him. They could not ask what he did after leaving Catherine's home. Every question would remain unanswered. That is the cruelest part of the timeline. The identification came too late for interrogation. The truth arrived after the person who might have explained it was gone. The family received the name. But they did not receive the confession. They received confirmation. But not closure in the fullest human sense. And perhaps that distinction is why the story remained so powerful. For 61 years, the family had lived with uncertainty. Now they had certainty about the identity. But the emotional wound was still there. Sandy Carmichael had been the person who discovered Catherine's body. She had carried that memory for decades. Imagine living with an image like that while knowing the person responsible had never been identified. Imagine wondering whether he was still alive. Imagine seeing strangers on the street and knowing that one of them might have been the man who destroyed your family. Then imagine being told, 6 decades later, that investigators had finally identified him. But then learning that he had died in 1998. There would be no courtroom.
No confrontation. No sentence.
Only a name. For some families, that might feel incomplete. For others, the name itself is a form of release. Because uncertainty has a different kind of cruelty. When the killer is unknown every possibility remains open. Maybe he escaped. Maybe he changed his identity. Maybe he committed another crime. Maybe he was still alive. Maybe the family could encounter him without knowing. The DNA identification eliminated those possibilities. Now the family knew. The man responsible had died. He could no longer harm anyone. And the mystery surrounding Catherine's murder had a definitive biological answer. The case had crossed a boundary. Before the DNA result, investigators had a cold case. After the result, they had a solved homicide involving a deceased suspect. That distinction may sound technical. For Catherine's family, it was enormous. For Albany, it meant another chapter of its criminal history could finally be closed. And for the investigators, it demonstrated why old evidence must be preserved. The handkerchief had survived. The biological material had survived. The old documents had survived. The original investigative work had survived. And because they survived, a new generation of investigators could return to the case. This is the hidden power of evidence. It does not need to be understood immediately. Sometimes its value is invisible. A detective in 1964 may collect something because procedure requires it. A technician may package it. A clerk may store it. A file may be transferred. A box may remain untouched for decades. Nobody knows whether the contents will ever matter again. Then one day, someone opens the box. And inside is the answer. That is what happened with Catherine Blackburn. The evidence did not become more important because time passed. It became more important because science finally caught up with it. The same biological trace that could not identify a person in 1964 became powerful enough decades later to connect a dead man to the crime. That is not just technological progress. It is the transformation of evidence into testimony. The handkerchief could not speak in 1964. But in 2025, its DNA profile could effectively point toward a person. And that person was Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The investigation had traveled through 3 generations of technology. From paper, to photographs, to biological analysis, from handwritten names, to genetic relationships, from a missing receipt, to a laboratory match, from Robert Broadhead, to Joseph Nowakowski, and from uncertainty, to identification. But there was still one haunting detail. Catherine's killer had apparently walked into her home. That meant that somewhere in the final hours of her life, there may have been a moment when she believed everything was normal. She may have thought she was simply meeting a prospective tenant. She may have had no reason to suspect danger. And that ordinary beginning makes the ending almost impossible to comprehend. Because the greatest danger did not necessarily announce itself. It may have arrived as a stranger asking to rent a room. A man with a name. A man with a story. A man who knew exactly how to appear harmless. And when the door opened, Catherine let him in. That may have been all the opportunity he needed. 61 years later, investigators finally knew who that man was. But the door remains closed in history. The exact conversation that occurred on the other side is gone. The final moments cannot be reconstructed completely. And the question of motive remains buried with the man who carried the answer to his grave. Still, the DNA left behind one undeniable message. The killer had been inside Catherine Blackburn's home. He had left biological evidence. He had walked away. He had lived for decades. He had eventually died. But the evidence followed him through time. And when investigators finally compared that evidence with DNA recovered from his remains, the mystery that had haunted Albany since 1964 finally had a name. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The name once missing from the case file was finally written into it. And this time, there was no missing receipt. No false identity.
No disappearing witness.
No unanswered laboratory question. Only the evidence. And the evidence had waited 61 years to speak.